this day and age, where we've got things like spy satellites, unmanned drones, all sorts of clever ways of gathering information, still the best information for an armoured force commander is having someone he trusts in a vehicle out ahead of the main force, radioing back exactly what he's seeing, because then that information's got no spin on it at all. It's what he needs to know. And to do that, the military has traditionally built small, fast reconnaissance or scouting vehicles. And this particular one coming on now, this is something called the Ferret scout car, and it was actually designed for the British Army just after the Second World War. Inside the museum you can see the Dingo scout car that we had in World War II. This is almost a development of it. Now the Ferret is often cited as being sort of like the classic, the best type of scouting vehicle. Why is that? Well, number one, you can see it's small. The smaller you are, not just the harder you are to see, but the harder you are to hit on the battlefield by the enemy. It's actually very fast as well. It can actually get to up to about 55 miles an hour on the open road, which for a 3-ton armoured vehicle is actually very good. So small, fast and agile means you're harder to see, harder to hit. It's also, you'll notice, it's wheeled. And wheeled vehicles tend to be quieter than tracked vehicles. We'll talk about that a bit later on as well, but wheels can't go to the same number of places as tracked, but if you can imagine you're trying to sneak up on the enemy or find out what's going on, wheels can be really useful because they're that much quieter. Now you can see with this vehicle, turret on the top, there's a driver in there, you can see you. Turret on the top, that's got the machine gun in, that's where the commander is. He's the one with the radio, he's got the binoculars, and he'll be looking out for where the enemy is all the time and radioing that back, radioing the routes forward, etc., back to the force commander. Driver's down the front, he's got all his hatches open at the moment. If he comes under fire, he closes those hatches down and he looks out at little periscopes. Now, you can look through some of those periscopes inside the museum. Great thing about them, of course, is if a bullet or something from a shell hits them, it may crack them, but nothing comes inside to wound the crew member or damage the vehicle. They have a quick release button on the side, out drops the old periscope, in goes a new one you carry with you, and off you go again. The downside of them, again, if you do look through those ones inside the museum, it's like looking at the world through a glass fish tank. They tend to distort the outside world a lot, and that's why you'll often see armoured vehicle drivers and commanders with their heads out the hatches till the last possible moment when they go into action, because the truth is, on most armoured vehicles, once you have all the hatches closed, visibility is appalling. In fact, in some armoured vehicles nowadays, they're putting video cameras around the outside, so the guys inside have got a much better idea what's going on. Spatial awareness, they call it. It's one of those things that, you really want to know what's going on outside if the enemy's creeping up on you, etc. So very, very important for keeping your head out, keeping an eye on what's going on. On that vehicle, things you've got on your car, headlights, brake lights at the back, that's because all British Army vehicles have to be road legal. Things you probably won't have, or I hope you haven't got in your car, like that machine gun. That's what they call a GPMG, General Purpose Machine Gun. It's really there for a bit of moral support for the crew. If you bump into the enemy in this vehicle, quick burst of machine gun fire to keep the enemy soldiers' heads down, and you back off quick. You are not there for fighting in a reconnaissance vehicle. You're there for gathering information. It's the tanks coming up behind you who are going to do the fighting. So this has actually got 5 reverse gears in the Ferret to get it out of trouble. It can go just as fast backwards as it can forwards. So imagine driving around one of these lanes like down here in Dorset, meet another tank coming the other way. The last thing you want to be doing is faffing around doing a 3-point turn, just whacking into reverse. He can go just as fast backwards. He looks out a little hatch he's got on the rear there to speed away quickly. Gathering information, again, that's what you're about. Other things there, canvas, tow ropes, all the sorts of things you see on lots of vehicles in the museum, things that you're going to need on campaign. There's a little silver box on the back, that's a cooker. You're expected to look after yourself, hot food, and you don't have hot food brought up to you. Those stubby little tubes on the front, you'll see them sometimes on tank turret sides, sometimes on front fenders. They're what's called smoke dischargers. And the idea there, in each of those tubes, about the size of a Coke can, is a smoke grenade. And if the vehicle comes under attack, the driver or commander, they can press a button Out flies a pattern of smoke grenades in front of the vehicle. Nice big smoke screen builds up very quickly, and again, you can manoeuvre, get out of trouble without the enemy seeing you. Vehicle, but it's because of the engine in the back. The engine driving this vehicle around is actually a Rolls-Royce petrol engine, and the British Army decided it wanted to go for what they call a one-fuel policy. All modern British Army vehicles now only have diesel engines, and that's for two reasons. One, the obvious one, if you've only got one fuel type, you don't make the mistake that sometimes we do with a family car, putting petrol in a diesel engine or diesel in a petrol engine. Now, you know how that causes an argument. You imagine that on the battlefield with your commanding officer. He's not going to be happy with you if you've ruined the vehicle that way. The other reason why they've gone for diesel is it's slightly harder to set on fire than petrol, and that means you've got more of an opportunity of the guys inside getting out before a vehicle goes up in flames. Hopefully, if you've been around the museum by now, you'll realise this one's not a tank. This is what the military call an APC, or an Armoured Personnel Carrier. And this vehicle looked like a box on tracks. This is for taking soldiers into action to where the fighting is so they can keep up with the tanks. Now, if you've seen inside the museum our First World War trench display, that very first tank only went at 4 miles an hour, and it was like a mobile battering ram. It was there to crush down the barbed wire, let our infantry follow on behind it so they could get in the German trenches without getting held up and massacred. Now, by the Second World War, tanks are doing many more things on the battlefield, and they're doing them much faster. So that's when countries start building, like the Americans and the Germans, half-track vehicles. Put the soldiers in the back, let them keep up with the fighting. And when this vehicle here was made in the 1960s for the British Army, pretty much every army in the world that had a tank made a vehicle like this for bringing soldiers forward. Now in the back there, they're going to give you a wave. There they are. There's some volunteers. We picked out the audience a bit earlier on today. We've given them a helmet, we've given them a gun, and a bit later in our display they're going to show us how a vehicle like this might be used in a combat situation. Now you can see at the moment, driver's down the front there. He's got the square hatch. He sits right next to the engine, which is in the front of the vehicle. Commander sits behind, he's got the round hatch. Sometimes they fit a machine gun there as well, again for putting that suppressing fire down on an enemy position. And the infantry, they're in the back, they're almost on bench seats running down the side of that box-like vehicle. And the military sometimes call these battle taxis. They're there, as I said, for taking the soldiers forward, keeping up with the tanks, and then letting the soldiers out the back. There's a big door at the rear, debussing it's called, to finish the attack on foot. So the soldiers don't actually fight from inside this vehicle, it delivers them to where the fighting's going on. Now this vehicle, designed back in the 60s, went into service at the end of the 60s. Amazing enough, it's called FE, Fighting Vehicle 432. Sometimes vehicles get nice names with them, sometimes they seem to get lumbered with their production names. FE 432, still in service with the British Army today. Very simple vehicle, so it was used for lots of roles, not just armoured personnel carriers. Some were made into ambulances, some carried engineer equipment, some fired mortars through that roof at the back there. They're mainly used now down here at Bovington for training, but they can upgrade them if they need to go into service. As an armoured personnel carrier, they've been replaced in the British Army by the Warrior, and that's a much more powerful, bigger vehicle. They actually technically call that an IFV, an infantry fighting vehicle, because the soldiers inside can actually fight from it, not just be delivered to where the fighting is. The Warrior's got a turret on the top, so it's got a cannon in as well. And the Warrior engine is actually a starter motor from a destroyer, so it can belt that vehicle around the battlefield really quickly. And again, as I said earlier, speed on the battlefield is actually a defence in itself. The quicker you are, the less chance the enemy are going to knock you out. And like many armoured vehicles today, the 432, if it was to go off on campaign to fight somewhere, that's when they add all the extras to the vehicle. In training they tend to be in this state. When they're off on campaign, that's when they add the extra bar armour, anything that might be needed in that part of the world. For example, we have one of these vehicles with an air conditioning unit in the back to keep the guys inside nice and cool if they were going to the Middle East. Right, so that was an armoured personnel carrier, now a proper tank at last, I hear you say. This tank coming on now, this is a tank that takes us back to that era of the Cold War. That's where we thought the Russians, the Eastern Bloc, the communist countries, might be going to war with the Western nations, that's the NATO countries, the capitalist countries. And we knew the Russians had lots and lots of tanks. So in the West, we decided we were never going to match the Russians tank for tank in sheer numbers. We were going to go for our technological advantages. And that's the thinking behind this whopping tank, the Chieftain, that goes into service with the British Army in the late 1960s. When it comes into service, it's by far the most powerful tank in the world at the time. Now, at the end of World War II, the British Army said we are never going to war again with a tank that has less firepower than the enemy or less armour protection. We were fed up of being knocked around by those bigger German tanks at the end of the war, like the Tiger, the Panther, the King Tiger, those vehicles you can see inside the museum. And again, you can see that thinking going into this tank. The Chieftain has a massive 120mm gun on it. A high velocity gun. So what does all that mean? 120mm gun, that's the size of the hole at the end of the barrel, so 12 centimetres across. High velocity, this gun fires rounds out with a huge amount of force behind them, and it's all designed for knocking out other tanks. When this fires at another tank, it doesn't fire a bullet-shaped round like we're used to seeing coming out of a rifle or a pistol. It fires a cylinder out the end of the barrel. And when that cylinder leaves the end of the barrel, it's one of the fastest things on earth. The sides of the cylinder fall away, and it reveals about a 13-inch long metal dart. No explosive on that dart at all, a couple of fins on the back to keep it straight in flight, just like a dart you throw at a dartboard. That dart is made of tungsten or depleted uranium. That's a very dense, heavy metal, twice the weight of steel, tungsten. And just by the sheer kinetic energy, in other words, the sheer amount of welly behind that metal dart, it will smash its way into an enemy tank, quite often all the way through and out the other side. Now, the crew of a Chieftain was so well trained, they got to the point that that gun was so accurate they could hit a tank-shaped target 98 times out of 100 with the very first round out to 3 kilometres away. So in other words, if this gun's pointing at you and you're in range, you're a goner. Very, very accurate. And it had to be because they worked out that this tank was going to have to knock out about 6 of the enemy tanks before we could afford to lose it. So it had to be at least 6 times better because of the numbers it was up against. Now in that turret to service the gun, the commander's on the top, he's got the hatch open at the moment. He's got the higher position. He's telling the driver, who's the 4th crew member right down the front, where to go because he can see more, he's higher up. He's also mainly looking out for targets as well for the gunner that sits in front of him. And when the gunner has got that target, he does the fine aiming with a little joystick, with a pistol grip on that joystick, and he's the one that pulls the trigger and fires that whopping 120mm gun. On the other side of the turret, the 3rd crew member in that turret space is a loader. And if you ever have to pick a tank crew, pick your loader, someone who's short, stocky, and built like a Russian shot putter, because the rate of fire of this tank will go down as the loader is getting worn out. He's got to pick up those cylinders with the metal darts in, he puts it in the breech of the gun, followed by a bag of explosives to blast it out. And the quicker you can do that, the quicker the gunner can aim the gun and fire it, the better chance you've got of winning the engagement. Driver, I've mentioned, is right down the front, and he drives this vehicle in what they call a supine position. He's almost driving it lying on his back, because the lower he can be, the lower the gun barrel can be over his head, and that means the whole profile of the tank, the turret, everything is lower down, and that means you're a harder target to see and to hit by the enemy. So tremendously powerful gun, very, very accurate, very well-trained crews, very thick armour. And when the Russians got bigger guns on their tanks, we added more armour to the front of our turrets. You can see on this one, either side of the barrel, they're almost like cheek pieces. This is called Stilbrough armour that was added later to up the levels of protection. The one weak point of the Chieftain was the engine in the back. And those of you who are old enough to remember the days of British Leyland, unfortunately this was something called the Leyland L60 multi-fuel engine. It was supposed to run on anything, you know, diesel, petrol, bottle of vodka, whatever you could find. The engine was the weak bit. And when Middle Eastern countries came to Britain to buy the Chieftain, they insisted it had a new engine in the back before they take it. But a very successful tank. And again, it's that weird thing. We all know the Cold War never became a hot war. But those tanks, this tank, never fired its gun in anger. Out in Germany, those crews did their job, they sat there waiting, so you might call this the most successful tank we've ever had, because it did its job without actually having to be used. So very successful from that point of view. And we'll get the driver to move off now. Engine's in the back, you hear it crunching away. Now that engine is only driving two wheels on that tank, just like any track vehicle. On the Chieftain there are spoked wheels, ones with the teeth on at the rear. And the idea of tracks is you're taking your own road with you, you're laying it down in front of the vehicle, you bite into that road wheel, that trackway with the wheels that are driven by the engine, the ones with the teeth on, you pull yourself along it. The wheels that are resting on the track on the ground, as it were, they're not powered at all, they're just spreading the weight out. And the wheel at the front, or on some vehicles at the back, that's is there for what they call the idler wheel, is just keeping that track nice and tense. So again, the idea, lay down your roadway, bite into it, pull yourself along it, and pick it up behind you and throw it forward again. And all of that is to spread the weight out over the ground, so you don't sink in. Yeah, that's to keep you all away. Now, part of the training for a Chieftain tank crew, they were all locked, all four of them were locked in that tank for 72 hours on the trot. That's part of your NBC, Nuclear Biological Chemical Warfare training. Now, if you can imagine that maybe with your family or whoever you are here with today, four of you, smallest room in your house, locking yourselves in there for 72 hours on the trot. And that means, of course, eating, drinking, all your bodily functions in full view of each other. You can understand why a tank crew has got to be well trained. There is nowhere in a tank you can have an argument and go storming off to your bedroom. So no secrets at all as well between a tank crew. So That training, of course, that still goes on here at Bovington, up on the camp there. That's where they learn how to drive and maintain the vehicles. Down at Lulworth, that's the gunnery ranges, that's where they learn how to fire the vehicles, guns. And there's lots of other things trained here as well, apart from just tanks, so still going on. Ranges, by the way, they're open, you can walk through them, have a look, stick to the paths, because there's all sorts of interesting things lying around, but they're not firing at the moment, so it's a nice area you can go and visit. So, that was our Chieftain tank.